Massard Road is an arterial roadway in the east side of Fort Smith, Arkansas, running from north to south for much of its northern half, and then turning southeasterly where it meets I-49 and terminates. For much of its length, Massard is a commercial corridor, but on its extremities, it's primarily residential. This residential section of Massard Road has long been planned as a 4-lane arterial, and the city of Fort Smith has slowly built out that plan for several years. In 2018, the city bid out the second phase of this Massard widening project, bringing the residential corridor of Massard from a 2-lane road to a 4-lane boulevard. This work, which was completed during the pandemic, included 2 new lanes of pavement, a grass median, new curbs and gutters, new sidewalks and driveways, handicap ramps, concrete retaining walls, new manhole frames and covers, drainage, piping, traffic signals, crosswalks, and traffic signs. That project was completed for about $5.2 million for about 1 mile of work. This video is part of a series about the third phase of that widening project, scheduled to begin in 2025 with completion in 2027. The third phase expansion project is expected to cost $14.5 million and will be a completion of the widening began with the second phase. This series of videos is why I am against the third phase of widening and why I think you should be too, whether you live near Massard or somewhere else in Fort Smith, or if you live in Greenwood or Little Rock or Hamburg, Germany. This first video discusses urban growth patterns and how they relate to roadways like Massard, a broad overview for the rest of the series, but without providing much nuance. I'm not even going to talk about Massard Road specifically, but I will introduce the concepts that we'll delve into for the rest of the series when we apply them to the Massard widening project to show that widening Massard will make traffic worse, not better. It won't create new wealth or increase tax revenue for the city. It will hurt the small-town feel of Fort Smith. But before I begin this video and the rest of the series, I have a huge disclaimer. The grace that some of you will have to grant me is that I'm not a traffic engineer, urban planner, or economist. I'm not good at much anything other than playing city-building video games and digesting what smarter people, actual engineers, planners, and economists have written, then confidently repeating their ideas in a way that might make me sound like I'm trying to be a subject matter expert, even though I am not, and not trying to claim to be. So please, do not take me for a subject matter expert, and if I use a word or phrase confidently but incorrectly, offer me your forgiveness and gentle correction. But I do have experiences that can be strengths. In my lifetime, I've seen Harrison, Arkansas transform from a quiet, sleepy town for retirees into a noisy, congested, and aggressive city. It shifted from a traditional development pattern to a modern one. A traditional development pattern is a lot like what it sounds like, quiet streets and corner stores. And that can mean traditional families. But the traditional family wasn't just mom, dad, and 2.5 kids. It was also Nana moving in when she was ready to downsize. Or it was a nephew sleeping on the couch while he tries to make it in the big city. Or it might have been a son staying with mom and dad just a few extra years while he starts a business in the garage. All of these different types of families are traditional, and they needed traditional housing options, duplexes, backyard cottages, or apartments over the garage. These are all things you'll find in Fort Smith's traditional neighborhoods. If I could summarize traditional development patterns in one phrase, I would call it the practice of maintaining a small town feel in a city, no matter how big the population of the city gets. Here are some words for or components of modern development patterns that you will not find in traditional development patterns. Urban, suburban, or exurban sprawl. Car-centric development. Leapfrog development. Exclusionary zoning. Texifornia. Or the phrase we'll use in this video series, speed-first development. You might think Harrison transformed into a busy and congested city because of population growth, but between 1990 and today, the city has only grown by about 3,000 people. If a city of only 13,000 people can't prevent itself from feeling like a congested mess, is there hope for any city to preserve its small town feel? I say yes, and I can spend a lot of time thinking about this question for cities all over the country. In Harrison, the largest driver of this change towards speed-first development was a new bypass. Harrison is a major shipping route connecting Little Rock to Springfield, Missouri, and the population of Harrison doubles itself every day on account of this traffic. So they constructed the bypass to help relieve the through traffic and allow it to speed past Harrison without having to stop at so many stop signs. But how did building a new road, offering new travel options, make traffic worse? Traffic got worse because that spreading out meant the same number of cars traveled further distances to get to their destinations. We often measure traffic by number of cars on the road, but have you considered one car traveling 100 miles in the city per day creates more traffic than 5 cars traveling 10 miles each? The number of miles that cars travel also causes traffic. In Harrison, the number of trips stayed the same, but the number of miles traveled increased after the bypass was built. The new road also makes it easier for people to get into the city from outside, which created a new market for housing outside of city limits, which also exacerbated the number of miles traveled. There is no planner or engineer smart enough to outsmart the market. After building the bypass, local businesses, being as enterprising as they are, noticed that their customers were no longer driving on the old Highway 65. Their customers were now new traffic on the bypass. So the entire city of Harrison essentially shifted itself over 2 or 3 blocks to the right, leaving the old Highway 65 to diminish and to start a new main drag on the bypass. Companies that could afford it, such as Walmart, moved their stores to the end of the bypass to capture the traffic from both routes. Before it moved, that Walmart was the oldest continuously operating Walmart in the world. The new store still gets to be called store number 2, and I worked there briefly, but we can't honestly call it the oldest Walmart anymore. The bypass ruined that. I am oversimplifying some local history here. The Walmart moved twice. And the Harrison City Planning Commission was probably on board with all these new developments on the bypass because new developments are often confused for new growth and new wealth. But the new roadway did not create any new wealth as intended. All it did was move the wealth 2 or 3 blocks over and spread it out over a further distance. Like Harrison, Fort Smith and most local governments are functionally insolvent due to this planning model. This pave and pray method produces more long-term liabilities than revenue potential because it moves wealth but does not create new wealth. That moved wealth might increase tax revenue slightly when it moves, but not enough to pay for the cost of the new road. That is why I call it pave and pray. The city paves a road and prays that it will fill with enough new developments to pay for itself. Rogers Avenue in Fort Smith is the new risky gamble today, and it will fail in a few decades. Then the wealth will just move to Massard once Massard gets widened. This process isn't immediate, and many of you listening to this now may not even be alive to see it because it can take decades. But we've already seen it happen in our town. The second point about financial concerns is economic productivity. Productivity is a ratio between output and input. If a city puts in $1 worth of services, such as police, fire, and water for a parcel, it should ideally expect to get output above $1. It actually has to be a lot more than $1 because the house and others like it also have to pay for every other parcel in the city that don't pay taxes. Government offices, playgrounds, fire stations, they all need to be paid for through surplus productivity. How productive a neighborhood is can vary wildly from neighborhood to neighborhood with dozens of variables that cities can and cannot control. But if we measure productivity in different cities around the country and compare their productive neighborhoods, we can contrast and compare, find the things that the productive neighborhoods all have in common, then isolate those variables and find ways to encourage them in Fort Smith. There are consulting firms like Verdunity and Urban 3 who will come to your town, measure your areas of high and low productivity, and share with you what tools might work well for your city and what won't.
This is their roads and when the roads were built. And we can all see in 1953, they built a lot of lean miles of roads. Guess what? That comes back to haunt them in 1983 for the first rebuild. Then, what they did, because they were in the hole, is they built more roads to get revenue. So what you'll see is when you look back at your hometowns and you see the periphery grow, that's all new taxes to cover up the losses they've already covered. Strong Towns calls this a Ponzi scheme. And they're right. If you're not looking at the cost and consequences of this stuff, you're taking in all of these new calories without understanding your diet. So this comes back for a second rebuild, and it brings along with the new stuff. So we showed them, so look, we're just going to stop you in 2016. Here's your rebuild schedule of all of your roads. Does that look sustainable to you?
Almost universally, the productive neighborhoods are in the neighborhoods built with traditional development patterns. I've tried making these measurements a bit myself for Fort Smith. I have a spreadsheet of every parcel of land in Fort Smith on it, and according to that, the most productive parcels in Fort Smith are mixed-use developments. And mixed-use developments are a hallmark of traditional development patterns. That means corner stores or an apartment on the second floor above a flower shop. These types of spaces have surplus productivity that funds police and fire and sewer projects for everyone else. Speed-first development is also just worse to be in. It's louder, it's more dangerous, and there's less and less reason to go outside. To illustrate that, let's compare some actual examples of traditional developments and speed-first developments side by side. Fort Smith used a grid for 150 years, which is a type of traditional development pattern, but is not the only type. Here is what a grid looks like. Here are some things to notice about it. First, there are limited sidewalks and bike paths. This is because they don't need sidewalks or bike paths in this type of neighborhood. These streets are quiet and peaceful and safe enough without them. Kids can have paper routes, go trick-or-treating, or get to soccer practice or school safely. That might also be why there's enough demand for 4 churches in this one little neighborhood. Second, there's connectivity. If you want to travel east from your house, you go east. If you want to go south, you go south. Number 3, there are a variety of housing types and businesses. Single-family homes, duplexes, apartments, churches, Spradling Elementary, retail. Just outside of this image are the fairgrounds, a Burger King, a plant nursery, and a convenience store. Things might look a little rough around the edges due to age, but the economy in this neighborhood is diversified and suited to weather downturns. 4. All of the above are a result of this neighborhood being built organically, that is, on the free market and one block at a time. The roads grew as the market dictated, not because someone drew them that way on a map in years past. In contrast to the traditional neighborhood, here's a speed-first neighborhood coming soon to Fort Smith. The taxpayers paid to pave this highway stretching along the north, and then in order to pay for that highway, they pay for developers to build neighborhoods alongside it like this one. That's why I call these types of new roads a subsidy, because they subsidize developers without waiting for the market to demand for a new road. What can we do to make this speed-first neighborhood a traditional one? The first thing I notice is the amenities. It's not connected to any park, any church, any school, or anything. The only thing that it's connected to is a highway. There's no chance for the community to have a central meeting place, or for people to take their dogs on an interesting walk. So let's add an amenity. If you lived in this neighborhood and wanted to travel south, you'd have to go out of your way north first. That's a non-annoying 2 extra minutes for someone in a car, but for a walker or a cyclist is a deal breaker. I'm staying home. And if I'm a teenager, I'm probably staying home on social media, learning bad habits from strangers with ulterior motives. So let's build some connections to future neighborhoods in each of the cardinal directions. This brief introduction to traditional development patterns will be fleshed out in more detail over the coming videos in this series, and we'll apply them all to the Massard Widening project as a real application to theoretical concepts. If you found yourself questioning the credibility of any of my claims or ideas, or you're interested in learning more, I encourage you to keep watching for the next video. Thanks, and I'll talk to you soon.